Well, good morning. It's walk and talk time, and today I just wanted to come back and talk about the question of Christian education. Again, you may remember I talked about this. It was kind of off topic slightly, sort of discussion I got into a few weeks back about. I think I was talking about not making Christianity weirder than it needed to be, and I talked a bit about why I agree with the concept of Christian education, but I disagree with the whole idea that that means that Christians have got to withdraw their children from state education, that they've got to either homeschool them or to put them into private Christian schools. And that's important because at the moment there's a judicial review case which is happening concerning private schools. The Labour government, when they came into power, they made a commitment in their manifesto, and this was brought in their manifesto, to introduce VAT to private schools. Now, that was a big step because education has been considered a charitable pursuit, and so private schools as offerers of have that sort of charitable status, and so have been exempt from VAT for pretty much forever. And there has been some pushback, as you might expect, from the independent, the private school sector, and this has led to a number of schools and organisations bringing court cases. And over I think it's sort of like these past sort of couple of days, sort of towards the end of this week, those that have brought this case of judicial review have been making their case, and judges will be making a decision. Important to say, I've seen the newspapers describe this as the government being sued. That's not quite the right language for what happens with a judicial review. The purpose of a judicial review is to look at a decision that has been made by those in authority, whether that's local government or national government, so often departments of state, to decide whether in effect it is unlawful. And historically, the reasons why it could be unlawful have been first because the process was wrong, that there hasn't been due process. Second, because there's something about it that is disproportionate, or thirdly, because it is considered unreasonable. The last one often proving difficult to prove. Now, in recent years, an additional reason has been given, and that is that it doesn't comply with human rights law, that it would go against the European Convention on Human Rights. That's been enacted in British law against the Human Rights Act here. And that's a slight adaptation because it means that primary legislation, i.e. Acts of Parliament, and remember the budget is brought in with the Finance Act to make those taxes permanent. Those things tend to be not what judicial review is dealing with. It tends to be regulations and directives and administrative decisions that don't go through a full vote in Parliament, because Parliament has sovereignty, and we don't have a written constitution that it is subject to. But the human rights approach has changed that, and that is the basis on which these cases are being brought. So there are a couple of interesting questions here. The first is to whether or not the government have acted unlawfully by bringing in VAT on private education. And the second one is whether or not Christians should be bringing a case here. And I want to look at both of them. So first of all, has the government acted unlawfully? And I guess that breaks down into two parts. The first is whether or not it is possible for those schools to win their case. And secondly, whether or not they should. And those are slightly different questions, aren't they? Because I think it is possible to look and say, look, on the day, they could win this case. The judges might agree in their favour, but it is also possible to say, when you actually think about this carefully, when you look at the law, I don't know why they would make that decision. I don't think they should make that decision. I think the judges will be getting it wrong. And that does mean that the two are kind of a little bit interlinked. But let's talk about that. So what is the case being brought? Well, there are a number of parties and a number of reasons being given. And so the reason that Christians are party to the case is that they are arguing that this is about freedom of religion, as well as a right to education. So they're arguing two things. So the starting point is this, that we have a right to education under the European Convention. And there have been some lawyers, some barristers who have argued over time that an attempt to impose VAT on private schools, anything that would restrict private schools, by making it harder for those currently accessing those private schools to do so, or by putting those private schools in a position where they become financially untenable and they have to close. The argument is that would be putting a restriction on education, that the freedom to, the right to education means not just that education has to be accessible and provided, but that there's got to be that ability for us to choose how and where we educate our children. And then the freedom of religion, the right to freedom of religion argument is that these Christians believe that they should have the right, and they must have the right to send their children to Christian schools. And that if they're not allowed to, that denies their religious freedoms. It goes against their faith. That's an important thing to hold on to. But there are other parties to this, and so some of the people that bring in the case are doing so because they're arguing that their children need special education needs to be provided for due to health and disability concerns, and that they are unable to access that education within the state sector, and therefore have had to go outside to get specialised education. Well, that then means that they have often had to make sacrifices to pay the fees, and again the risk is that those private special education schools would close, and it also means that they would the parents would find it harder to pay the fees and they need to pull out. I think it's also sort of worth sort of thinking that this may not necessarily be about a special education needs provider closing, but it may be that the parents concluded that due to particular health issues, potentially I guess around sort of things like neurodiversity, that private independent providers are able to provide things like smaller class sizes, one-to-one, the kind of environment, the sort of other things that are going around that might not be available from a lot of state schools. Now, that's the case. And as I said, the first question is, might they win? The second one is, should they win? I think there is a possibility that the case might be one that the judicial review might be agreed, that the government might be told that they are acting unlawfully. I am not sure how this would happen in terms of freedom of education, and that will come more to my argument about whether they should win, because my view is that they shouldn't. It's certainly the Christians taking the case for freedom of religion reasons. But the Send case, I think, makes it a little bit more complex. I think that there may be real arguments there to be heard, and the government may be advised that they have not thought through the implications of this properly, and that they need to think again. And I think that is the reason where there's a possible case. I still think it feels to me like this is there's an outside chance of that, because one of the things that the courts are very reluctant to do is to get involved in sort of matters of fiscal policy, of taxation and that kind of thing. They don't tend to get involved in that, partly because it's more complicated to untangle, but I think also as well because it is harder to prove as well. It's harder to show that there's actually discrimination here. I mean, and just think about it this way: if you are paying £10,000 a year for special education, for your education, private education, and if you've got 2 or 3 children and you're paying just so some of the lowest fees I've heard are like £7,000, that still means you're finding £20,000, then that is already in and of itself a significant barrier, a significant hurdle to the vast majority of children getting that kind of education that is beyond most people's means to pay for that kind of education provision. So that in effect you could argue that any changes to taxation and any changes to income benefits, the minimum wage, all those kinds of things could be argued to have some kind of impact that would affect the ability of those already in education, already using private sector provision to pay for it. And in any case, by not doing anything, you would in fact discriminate against lots and lots of people. So I think that looks quite slim as a case. And I think people have been very quick to say, hey, look, there have been some lawyers that have argued and given advice to political parties in the past, that people like Lord Panic, that it breaches equality laws, etc., and would be unlawful. I think it's worth remembering that a lawyer, a barrister, making an argument is very different from a judge reaching a verdict, and it is also very different for a lawyer to have a speculative view. You go back, Lord Panic has been making these claims, making this advice, I think, since the 1980s. It's very different from have a speculative view on the effect that might happen for a hypothetical taxation in the future. That is very different to actually looking and saying, what is the reality on the ground in terms of what has happened, what is happening. So I think the judges are going to be cautious. But the special education needs may just tip the balance. Who knows? And if it does, I think it's then important to consider what the impact is. It doesn't mean that means the taxation is just suddenly dropped. It would mean that the government have to recognise that the current law is in conflict with human rights treaties and human rights law, and they would need to do something about that. That would take time. No doubt there'd be appeals as well, but also it would mean that they would need to look about ways in which they could make it compatible with the law. And there are a number of ways they could do that. They could repeal the Human Rights Act, which is something and withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, not something I'm advocating for. Something fascinatingly that the opposition parties have talked about at different times. Or they could simply amend the legislation, the finance legislation providing for this tax. Which is what, if you remember, this is what the Conservative government did when the courts ruled that their Rwanda asylum seeker plan was unlawful. Of course, they just got that through, and then there was a change of government. But there are various ways that they could amend it. They could grant exceptions. They could do things to make it less sort of penal. They could say that it only applies to schools of a certain size or charging fees at a certain threshold. They could exempt those with special education needs, all those kinds of things would make it palatable. So those are some possibilities, some of which might help the Christians with their case, in their situation, some of which would not. Now, I think it is sort of therefore important for us to think about whether or not they should win, and I want to speak specifically about the Christians here, whether it would be a just decision if the case was decided in their favour, because that will lead us into the question of should they be taking this case, and should Christian organisations like Christian Concern be particularly campaigning on it. And my view is that they shouldn't. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the ethical stuff, if you like. But in terms of the legal situation, and I've already given you a heads up on some of the issues here, but I just think it seems so difficult to make the argument that this is discrimination, that this just does go against human rights. Firstly, just in terms of that question, does it deny anybody their right to an education? Well, it doesn't. And it doesn't deny them a right to choice in education. Partly because the very fact that fees are charged in the first place at quite a significant level means that this choice isn't available to most people, regardless of age, gender, race, religion, disability. But also because there are lots of other choices available. There are choices in terms of you have still got the right to educate at home. You have got the option of free schools, as well as academy trusts and those kinds of things. So it's possible to be taught in schools that effectively function within the state sector with free education, but outside of the sort of the main sort of local authority education provision. And those kids have a lot of freedom around curriculum, a lot of freedom around management stuff and all those kinds of things. Another reason why I don't think this would be the right decision in law is that basing a claim on freedom of religion seems very hard to me when you are making a claim that lots and lots and lots and lots of Christian parents do not, and that there bluntly isn't a biblical basis for. There's nothing in God's word that requires us to withdraw our children from state education provision. I should have mentioned earlier as well, just in terms of another choice that parents have is the voluntary aided sector. So there are a lot of, mainly Church of England, also some Catholic schools as well, that are within state provision, and the state assistance to them and education is provided free. but they are religious schools. But back to that next point, discrimination on the basis of religion. Well, first, you've got to prove that you are being discriminated on because of your religion, or that there's an indirect discrimination against you, and I just don't see how that threshold is met, because the overall conclusion within Christianity and within evangelical Christianity even is that this isn't a requirement. So I would ask, how are you being discriminated against? But really, the only thing that is being discriminated against is personal preference of some people. The other side to that, again, is that because we have this thing called free schools, and because there's the voluntary aided provision as well, then the schools themselves are not being discriminated against, because it is possible to operate a free school or a voluntary aided sector school and therefore not charge fees for students. So my view is that I can see a slim possibility on the day because of the send factor. I'm not convinced that this is a case that is likely to be one, but I could be wrong on that. But I also think that when you look at the legal situation, it isn't really a case that it should be one. And that takes us to therefore, should Christians be making the case? Now, I think that I believe there would be situations where it would be right to try and make a legal case, even when you know it is unlikely that you will win, and even when you know that in terms of what the law says, in terms of under the law, that you shouldn't win that case, that you want that the government, the local authority, whoever, have acted within the law as it stands. And there's an obvious reason as to why there are times when we should do that. The reason is that we might want to take a stand on an ethical issue. We might want to make it clear that the law itself is wrong. And that might even mean that we need to take a case and to lose the case. So, for example, I think it would be right to take cases, I think two particular areas. I think it would be right to take cases regarding assisted suicide. And if the Assisted Suicide Act passes, I think that would be the legitimate next step for Christians. But I think that there are, in that sense, I think there are again possible arguments that might make the case winnable, but I think there would also be a strong case to say, actually, anything that happens after the act is passed is going to be lawful, and that we would lose the case, and in legal terms perhaps should. I guess the other area is around these exclusion zones that have been set up around abortion clinics, and whilst I have not been comfortable with some of the things that Christians have been claiming about, and some of the things we've been hearing from the United States about the situation. For example, private prayer has not been outlawed. For example, somebody standing outside the clinic with a sign saying, "Here to talk if you want," might try to claim, oh, I'm not really protesting, but I think they obviously are. And I might have questions about whether that is the wisest place to be, but I would say that there should be a freedom, there should be the right to protest, and I think Christians of all should have the freedom to protest against something that is so horrifically wrong. But again, I suspect that the conclusion would be no, this is lawful, although there are perhaps stronger reasons to challenge that under human rights. I mean, the problem is the perceived conflict of two different rights. There's the right to privacy, the right to be able to go to the abortion clinic without being able to protest, and also and that conflicts with the freedom of expressive freedom to protest, freedom of speech. Now, having said that, should we therefore, as Christians, be using judicial review to try and protest and try and prevent VAT on school fees? I want to argue, no, we shouldn't. And that is for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't think that this, in any shape or form, could be presented as discrimination against Christians. And even if it was discrimination against Christians, I think it would be legitimate to say, should we be focusing our efforts on protecting our perceived rights? But also, I think we need to even be more direct and ask whether or not the position of these schools is itself ethical. And it's funny because some of the arguments that they've tried to advance about why they're good and ethical and why they're not like Eton or other sort of schools that are charging huge fees actually tell us that they've got this wrong, that they've got the ethics wrong here. What I would want to say is that these private Christian schools taking fees are not, as they stand, ethical. Because the two big arguments that have been made are, first, that a lot of the students, people that come to their families, are not wealthy families, that they're making sacrifices. And so we're not talking about millionaires paying 30 grand to go to Eton or Harrow. We're talking about people on low income and even some people on benefits making sacrifices so they can pay £7,000 or £8,000 per child to go to a Christian school. And then the other thing that's been argued is that the schools themselves, because they're charging as little as possible, because they're small entities, because of all the high running costs, because of the vulnerability, that often the teachers themselves are in effect taking a pay cut, that they are being paid much less than they would in a state school, and probably in other private schools as well. And that's been presented as, look at how ethical this is about people being sacrificial, this is about people on low incomes, this is about people wanting to do something because they believe in it. And actually I have a problem with that. I want to ask, what is Christian about convincing teachers, often sort of younger teachers, convincing them that they need to be teaching in Christian schools, that this is something so vital to their faith and the faith of others that they have to do it, so that in effect they are being exploited. And what is Christian about convincing parents that this is so important to their faith and the faith of their children, that they have to make this sacrifice, that they have to pay fees that they very clearly cannot afford, even before the VAT is brought in. That also looks like exploitation to me. So I think that these schools are actually unchristian, that it is grievous that Christian organisations that claim to be acting in concern for the Christian faith, that have that as their charitable aims, Christian concern for the nation, are actually pushing this case. And I wonder if a lot of the people that support that kind of charity, that kind of work, would agree that this is what they should be doing. That this kind of campaign, this kind of legal work is where the money that they've given to the charities should be spent. I'm not convinced they would be. And I would encourage local churches that are in partnership with Christian Concern to actually talk directly to Christian Concern and say, look, this is not tenable. You need to pull back from this. You need to admit that you've got this one wrong. I say this as someone who you would see a number of things that Christian Concern are concerned about, and a number of the cases that they've taken, a number of the arguments that they've made as good. Over the years, they've actually played an important role. I've had some reservations, particularly in recent years, about how they've picked up on some cases. I had strong reservations about their response to COVID, but also I still have much sympathy for their overall aims and for those that are involved. I have nothing personal against people within Christian Concern, but I think they do need to be challenged on this. I think they've got this one wrong. I hope they will step back from it. And I think we need to challenge directly those that have got themselves caught up in this absolute mess and say, look, I think you've got this completely wrong. And maybe, just maybe, this is a corrective in that God will use to bring you to your senses. Again, remember, just my theology in this, I'm not saying that the VAT is God's judgment on Christian schools and Christians that use Christian schools. But I am saying maybe this might be an opportunity to think again. And to think again about what we really should be concerned about. And if it's that important, if there are concerns that we have about the well-being of children and in education, then look, the answer is not to set up some schools that charge fees that most parents can't afford and that the parents that are coming really can't afford. but it's costing them other areas. So our response shouldn't be to underpay people to do the work of being a teacher. I'd love to hear your comments, your feedback, and just to see what you think about this. I think that this is helpful as well to think not just about this specific case, but about sort of wider issues as well. When should Christians go to the courts? What are our rights? Should we act to protect our rights? When and where? What are priorities? What is Christian education all about? Love to get you joining the conversation.